someone brought it from the university. 금일의 행사는 제32회 88서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회입니다. 안녕하십니까. 저는 금일의 행사 진행을 담당하게 된 연세대학교 스포츠응용산업학과 이준동 교수입니다. 반갑습니다. 금년도 제32회 88서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회는 코로나가 멈춘 일상, 스포츠로 극복하다라는 주제를 가지고 국내외 다양한 전문가들을 모시고 이곳 서울대학교 체육문화연구동을 비롯한 유튜브 온라인 라이브 방송을 통하여 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 본격적인 행사 진행에 앞서 금일 현장을 방문해 주신 귀빈 여러분을 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 우선 현재 국민체육진흥공단 이사장을 역임하고 계신 조현재 이사장님께서 함께해 주셨습니다. 다음으로는 현재 한국스포츠정책과학원 원장으로 재직 중이신 남윤신 원장님께서 함께해 주셨습니다. 더불어 지난 26대 한국체육회장을 역임해 주신 차관석 명예회장님께서 함께해 주셨습니다. 더불어 다양한 협력학회장님들께서 자리해 주셨는데요. 우선 정책학회 학회장으로 섬기고 계신 강효민 학회장님 함께 하셨습니다. 더불어 신철호 영양학회 학회장님께서 자리해 주셨습니다. 마지막으로 무용학회 회장으로 재직 중이신 김영남 회장님께서 함께 해주셨습니다. 자, 그러면 금일 행사를 본격적으로 시작하기에 앞서 우선 개막식을 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 개막식은 국민의례로 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 모두 자리에 앉아주시기 바랍니다. 자, 그러면 다음으로는 금일 개막식의 첫 번째 행사로서 현재 한국체육학회 회장을 역임하고 계신 김도균 회장님을 모시고 본 행사를 위한 개회사를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
존경하는 한국체육학회 체육가족 여러분 안녕하십니까. 한국체육학회 회장 김도균입니다. 코로나19의 여파가 지속되고 있음에도 불구하고 시간을 내어 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사드립니다. 지난해 초 확산된 코로나는 전 세계 인구의 2.5%인 2억 명 이상을 감염시켰으며 그 가운데 2002년 도쿄올림픽이 개최되었습니다. 개최 전부터 올림픽 정신 훼손, 후쿠시마 식자재, 폭염, 신종 코로나 바이러스 등으로 많은 논란이 제기됐던 올림픽이었지만 온 국민에게 감동을 주고 지친 일상에 활력을 불어넣어주기에 충분했습니다. 코로나19의 장기화로 전 세계가 침체되어 있는 지금 스포츠의 역할이 중요한 시점입니다. 이번 국제학술대회는 코로나가 멈춘 일상, 스포츠로 극복하다는 주제로 위드 코로나 시대 속에서 스포츠의 역할과 대응 전략 등의 현실적인 문제 등을 다루고자 합니다. 오늘은 6명의 학자들이 함께 이러한 문제에 대해서 논의를 하겠고 또 내일은 101인 101강이라는 그런 강의를 통해서 체육 분야의 전문가와 또 많은 지식들을 나누는 그러한 강연회 장이 펼쳐질 예정입니다. 이러한 국제학술대회를 통해서 국민의 건강 증진과 체육복지 실현과 스포츠 산업 전반의 방향성에 대한 공론의 장이 펼쳐지길 기대합니다. 바쁘신 중에도 불구하고 발제에 응해주신 발제자분들께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드리며 오늘 이 자리가 국내외 학자 간의 다양한 고견을 공유하고 더 나은 방향으로 나아갈 수 있는 지혜를 모으는 값진 자리가 되기를 바랍니다. 끝으로 이번 학술대회를 위해서 협조해 주신 문화체육관광부 황희 장관님, 대한체육회 이기영 회장님, 서울대학교 오세정 총장님을 비롯해서 오늘 기조 강연을 해주신 국민체육진흥공단의 조현재 이사장님께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 이러한 귀한 자리에 우리가 함께 다시 한번 서로 좋은 우위와 학문의 장을 나눌 수 있는 귀한 시간이 되길 바랍니다. 고맙습니다.
지금까지 김도균 한국체육회장님의 개회사를 들어보았습니다. 그러면 다음으로 오세정 서울대학교 총장님께서 사전에 제공해 주신 환영사를 녹화 영상을 통하여 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
서울대학교를 찾아주신 한국체육학회 김도균 회장님과 회원 여러분, 해외 학자와 내외 귀빈 여러분 만나 뵙게 돼서 반갑습니다. 서울대학교 총장 오세정입니다. 오늘 제32회 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회를 서울대학교에서 개최하게 되어 매우 기쁘게 생각합니다. 여러분들의 방문을 진심으로 환영합니다. 지난 1988년 개최된 제24회 서울 하계올림픽 경기대회는 우리나라의 스포츠 경기력은 물론 사회, 경제 다방면에서의 국위선양과 국민 삶의 질을 비약적으로 상승시키는 중요한 계기가 되었습니다. 우리에게 커다란 긍지와 자부심, 그리고 수많은 변화를 남겨준 올림픽의 성과와 정신을 기념하기 위해 개최되는 국제학술대회는 지난 32년간 신체 활동의 본질적 가치와 의미를 되새기며 사회적으로 성숙한 스포츠의 비전을 모색하는 학문 교류의 장으로서 국내외 체육계 발전에 큰 역할을 해왔습니다. 경중의 차이는 있으나 코로나19의 장기화로 전 세계인이 답답함과 우울함을 호소하며 어려운 시간을 보내고 있습니다. 이러한 신체적, 정신적 침체가 계속되고 있는 상황은 이를 극복하기 위한 스포츠의 역할과 필요성에 대해 다시 한번 강조하고 있습니다. 코로나로 멈춘 일상, 스포츠를 극복하다라는 명제 아래 진행되는 오늘 학술대회를 통해 우리가 직면한 현실을 진단하고 함께 지혜를 공유하여 체육계가 나아가야 할 방향과 국제 스포츠 동향을 선도해 나갈 새로운 비전을 고민해보는 좋은 기회가 되기를 바랍니다. 코로나19 확산 방지를 위해 온 오프라인을 겸하여 진행되는 이번 행사가 시간과 장소의 물리적 제약을 넘는 확장성으로 더 많은 참여를 이끌어내 성공적으로 치러지기를 기원하며 다시 한번 제32회 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 감사합니다.
지금까지 서울대학교 오세정 총장님의 환영사를 시청하였습니다. 다음으로는 문화체육부 체육관광부 장관으로 재직 중이신 황희 장관님의 축사를 영상을 통하여 시청하도록 하겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 문화체육관광부 장관 황희입니다. 제32회 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 88 서울올림픽은 한국 사회와 스포츠의 획기적 발전을 가져온 중대한 전환점이었습니다. 32년을 지나오며 스포츠의 가치와 지향점, 선수들과 국민들의 인식도 많이 달라졌습니다. 얼마 전 열린 도쿄올림픽에서 우리는 그 뜻깊은 변화를 확인할 수 있었습니다. 선수들은 승패를 떠나 경기를 즐기고 경쟁 상황에서도 상대를 배려하며 따뜻한 우정을 발휘했습니다. 우리 국민들은 그들의 도전에 박수를 보내고 그들의 열정에 눈물을 흘렸습니다. 국적은 달라도 관중 없는 경기장에서 최선을 다하는 선수들을 응원하던 우리의 마음도 하나였습니다. 여러분, 국가가 위기에 봉착했을 때마다 스포츠는 국민을 위로하고 다시 일어설 힘을 주었습니다. 전례 없는 코로나19가 장기간 이어지고 있지만 스포츠가 지금의 위기를 극복하는 데 크나큰 힘이 될 거라 믿습니다. 대한민국 정부는 모두가 일상에서 마음껏 스포츠를 누리는 스포츠 강국을 오래도록 꿈꿔왔습니다. 지난 6월에 제정된 스포츠 클럽법을 시작으로 잇따라 제정된 스포츠 기본법과 체육인 복지법은 스포츠 정책의 패러다임을 바꾸고 스포츠 생태계의 혁신을 이끄는 시작점이 될 것입니다. 또한 코로나로 어려움을 겪고 있는 체육계를 위해 스포츠 기업 금융 지원, 실내 체육시설 고용 지원, 민간 체육시설 이용 활성화 지원 등 각종 지원 사업을 다각도로 추진할 것입니다. 이번 학술대회를 계기로 학계와 정부가 스포츠를 통한 코로나19 극복과 제도약을 위해 함께 고민해 나갈 수 있기를 바랍니다. 우리의 노력으로 더욱 많은 사람들이 스포츠를 통해 일상을 되찾고 그 과정에서 누구도 소외되지 않기를 희망합니다. 뜻깊은 자리를 마련해 주신 한국체육학회 김도균 회장님과 임원진 그리고 운영 관계자분들께 감사드립니다. 고맙습니다.
다음으로는 현재 대한체육회 회장을 역임 중이신 이기흥 회장님의 축사를 영상 자료를 통해 시청하도록 하겠습니다.
진행하는 체육가족 여러분, 안녕하십니까. 먼저 제32회 88서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 유례없는 코로나19 확산이 지속되고 있고 전 세계가 많은 어려움을 겪고 있는 이때에 코로나가 멈춘 일상, 스포츠로 극복하다라는 주제로 이번 세미나가 열리게 된 것을 매우 뜻깊게 생각합니다. 코로나19 시대에서도 스포츠는 가장 중요한 화두입니다. 우리는 함께 어울려 땀 흘리고 우위를 나누는 대면 스포츠만이 가진 가치를 이어갈 수 있는 방법을 찾아야만 합니다. 이번 세미나에서 참석해 주신 여러분께서는 어려움 속에서도 스포츠가 바람직한 방향으로 나아갈 수 있도록 많은 고견을 내어주시기를 바랍니다. 끝으로 행사 준비를 위해서 애써주신 김도균 한국체육학회장님을 비롯한 관계자 여러분께 깊은 감사 인사를 드리며 함께해 주신 모든 분들의 건강과 행복을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 이기흥 회장님의 축사 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 그럼 오늘의 마지막 축사로 지금 학술대회 현장에 함께해 주신 한국스포츠정책과학원 남윤신 원장님을 모시고 원장님의 축사를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 한국스포츠정책과학원 원장 남윤신입니다. 어느덧 해가 지면 선선한 바람이 하루의 열기를 식혀주는 여름의 끝자락입니다. 1988년 서울올림픽, 패럴림픽이 열리던 그때의 여름은 유난히도 열기가 오래 지속되었던 것으로 기억합니다. 올해로 33년이라는 33회를 맞는 서울올림픽, 패럴림픽은 1988년 이후 한 해도 거르지 않고 국민체육진흥공단 주최의 공식 기념 행사를 가져왔습니다. 이와 함께 한국체육학회에서 유수한 학자들이 국제학술대회를 개최하여 서울올림픽을 기념해온 것이 언 32차례나 되고 있습니다. 그간 저는 체육학 학과의 교수로서 나름의 활동을 해오다 올 초에 한국 스포츠 정책과학원에 부임해 온 것을 돌이켜보니까 IOC와 올림피즘을 지향하는 올림픽 운동 레거시는 바로 지금 우리가 만드는 이 하나하나가 아닌가 생각합니다. 코로나19가 우리의 일상에 공존한 지 벌써 2해가 지나가고 있습니다. 많은 변화를 가져왔고 그 가운데서 우리는 절망하기도 했습니다. 직접적인 타격을 받은 스포츠 산업체들도 많이 있었습니다. 일자리를 잃고 어려움에 겪고 있는 동료, 선후배들, 그리고 무엇보다도 알 수 없는 스포츠의 미래로 우리는 불안하기도 했습니다. 이러한 상황 속에서 올림픽 운동이 무엇을 할 수 있을까 하는 의구심도 들었습니다. 그런데 우리는 모두 함께 한 번 또 목도했습니다. 1년여간 연기 끝에 2020 도쿄올림픽의 성화가 피어올랐고 짧지만 아름답고 아쉽지만 영원한 시간에 우리는 열광했습니다. 모든 종목과 경기의 마지막은 승리하는 인간의 탁월성이 돋보였고 경기 중 서로 배려하는 마음에서 드러나는 존엄의 가치 그리고 국경과 인정을 초월한 우정은 더할 나위 없이 아름다웠습니다. 이 세 가지 올림픽 가치일 뿐 아니라 우리를 코로나에서 웃음짓게 하는 그 진심 그 자체였습니다. 그래서 저와 여러분은 다시 한번 희망을 걸어봅니다. 오늘 이 자리를 마련하신 많은 분들 역시 저와 같은 감동을 가지고 발제와 토론을 준비하셨을 것으로 생각합니다. 이렇게 설레는 자리를 함께 할 수 있어 매우 저는 영광스럽습니다. 오늘 이 행사를 주최하신 한국체육학회에 큰 박수를 보내드리며 앞으로 계속될 서울올림픽, 패럴림픽 기념학술대회를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 감사합니다.
남윤신 원장님의 축사 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 다음으로 오늘 학술대회의 1부 행사를 시작을 하도록 하겠습니다. 금일 학술대회 1부 행사는 코비드-19과 스포츠라는 주제로 국민체육진흥공단 조현재 이사장님께서 기조 강연을 진행해 주시도록 하겠습니다.
방금 소개받은 서울올림픽 기념 국민체육진흥공단의 조현재입니다. 먼저 코로나19와 스포츠라는 주제로 한국 체육학회 주최의 88서울올림픽 대회 기념 국제학술대회에서 기조 발제기를 주신 데 대해서 감사와 함께 무한한 책임을 느낍니다. 오늘 이 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 32번째를 맞이하고 있는 걸로 오늘 자료집에서 봤는데요. 저는 아주 가슴이 벅찹니다. 1988년 저는 제가 뭘 하고 있었나를 한번 관출을 해보니까 당시에 올림픽을 준비하던 중국부처 체육부에서 담당 사무관으로 제가 일을 하고 있었습니다. 89년 4월 20일 서울올림픽이 끝난 이후에 서울올림픽 기념 국민체육진흥공단이 창립이 되었습니다. 서울올림픽 대회 레거시죠. 서울올림픽 대회 레거시는 서울올림픽이 남긴 유형의 유산들과 무형의 유산들이 있습니다. 유형의 유산들이라고 하면 서울올림픽 경기장들이겠죠. 그리고 서울올림픽 국민체육진흥공단도 서울올림픽 대회 레거시 유산이라고 생각합니다. 오늘 이 국제학술대회도 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 32번째를 맞이하고 있는데 이 국제학술대회 역시 88 서울올림픽 대회 중요한 레거시가 아닌가 이렇게 생각을 해봅니다. 오늘 국내 여러 저명한 학자들 앞으로 이틀 동안에 걸쳐서 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회에서 주제를 코로나19와 스포츠라는 주제로 해서 열리게 되는데요. 문을 제가 열게 되는 것에 대해서 다소 부담과 함께 기대감도 있습니다. 오늘 저는 제가 근무하고 있는 서울올림픽 기념 국제 국민 체육진흥공단 이 국가로부터 부여받은 소임과 그리고 앞으로 대한민국의 스포츠의 발전이라는 두 가지 측면을 연계해서 글로벌적인 관점에서 코로나19의 어떤 현상을 바라보면서 보다 더 큰 글로벌 시장 속에서의 스포츠의 가치와 또 발전에 대해서 이야기를 해볼까 합니다. 우리 모두가 다 여러분도 아시다시피 코로나19는 이번 도쿄올림픽에서도 저희가 보았듯이 결코 완전 무결하게 우리가 퇴치할 수 있는 질병이 아니라 위드 코로나로 인류 함께 공존해야 되는 그런 바이러스의 위기 상황의 시작이 될까 이렇게 말씀드릴 수가 있겠습니다. 지금 스포츠 분야뿐만 아니고 모든 영역에서 코로나19 속에서 지속 가능하게 발전할 수 있는 어떤 대안과 또 어떤 방향을 모색하는데 총력을 기울이고 있습니다. 우리 또한 예외가 아니죠. 코로나19 상황 속에서도 우리 스포츠 분야에서도 문체부를 비롯해서 각 체육단체에서 주마다 위치해서 스포츠의 발전을 유지하고 또 고사를 막기 위한 노력을 계속해 왔습니다. 여러분도 잘 아시다시피 도쿄올림픽이 유리가 없이 아마 올림픽이 2차 세계대전과 또 1차 세계대전, 세계대전으로 중단된 이후를 빼고는 처음으로 1년 연기된 초유의 상황을 맞이해서 이번에 우여곡절 끝에 치러졌습니다만 우리는 올림픽을 통해서 이번 도쿄올림픽에서 스포츠의 가치를 다시금 어렵사리 확인을 하고 있습니다. 우리 이러한 어떤 국제 스포츠 이벤트의 개최를 통해서 어떤 우리가 이를 극복하려는 우리의 역량 이런 것들이 조금씩 커져가고 있는 것을 목격을 하고 있습니다. 백신이 이제 보급되고요. 우리도 이제 백신 20% 이상 국민들이 백신을 접종이 되었죠. 치료제가 더 발달하고 또 우리 개개인들도 위생과 방역이 아주 더 철저해지고 있습니다. 국제사회에서도 연대를 통해서 이런 코로나를 극복하는 노력이 가시화되고 있습니다. 이런 상황 속에서 우리 스포츠는 올림픽을 통해서 또 하나의 가능성을 보여주고 있습니다. 여러 가지 우리 스포츠라고 하면 과거의 귀족들 중심의 어떤 유희가 오락이었다, 취미활동이었다 하면 이제는 이 스포츠는 모든 국민들이 스포츠를 해서 잘 실행하고 또 건강을 유지하고 또 이제는 이 스포츠가 단순히 취미나 건강 이런 걸 넘어서서 일자리의 창출과 지역 경제의 발전과 또 산업적인 측면에서 굉장히 중요한 부분이 되고 있습니다. 이런 점에서 저는 코로나19와 스포츠 이런 발전에 있어서 올림픽과 스포츠의 가치 그리고 과학기술의 발달, 스포츠의 발전에 초점에 맞춰서 한번 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 유엔의 경제사회 문제를 담당하는 부처의 발표에 따르면 코로나19에서 얼마나 많은 스포츠 쪽에 어떤 피해와 또 영향을 줬는가 이런 통계적인 데이터가 나오고 있는데요. 정말 이 코로나는 우리 특히 신체 활동과 웰빙 전반에 많은 영향을 미치고 있다는 데이터 통계가 발표가 되고 보고가 되고 있습니다. 이미 우리가 선진국에 진입했는데요. 선진국들에서는 스포츠가 경제와 산업 측면에서도 굉장히 중요한 영역입니다. 그래서 이런 대회와 이벤트들 이런 것이 연기와 취소들을 통해서 그리고 프로리그 대회 활동도 극히 제한적으로 열리고 있어서 이런 부분들은 경제, 사회적으로 아주 큰 손실로 연결되고 있습니다. 이번 여러분들도 잘 아시다시피 도쿄올림픽, 또 유로 챔피언십, 큰 프로리그들 이 사례만 보아도 잘 알 수가 있죠. 이번 도쿄올림픽 같은 경우도 1년 연기와 또 무관중으로 인해서 손실액이 아마 25조 이상으로 추산되고 있습니다. 또 스포츠 밸류에 따르면 미화 1달러의 투입으로 스포츠 분야에 대해서는 연간 2.5달러의 수익을 창출한다고 발표가 되고 있는데요. 이 스포츠 또 글로벌 마켓에서 보면 우리 스포츠 분야는 연간 7,650억 달러가 지금 통계상으로 발표가 되고 있는데 지금 4,200억 달러는 미국, 그리고 2,500달러는 유럽, 그리고 중국 시장에서 연간 1,500달러의 매출을 얻고 있는 산업적으로 굉장히 큰 시장입니다. 이러한 이 스포츠, 특히 유통시장 같은 경우는 전 세계 스포츠 프로리그 경기 취소 등으로 해서 이것은 또 연계적으로 미디어, 방송 중계권, 스폰서십 이런 부분에 영향을 주고 또 이것은 또 우리 스포츠 산업 전반을 강타할 수밖에 없는 그런 구조입니다. 그래서 우리 국내 상황도 국내 프로리그나 이런 상황 아주 유럽이나 미국보다 크지는 않지만 축구, 야구, 농구, 배구 같은 프로리그에 있어서 취소와 연기 또 관중, 무관중 이런 걸로 통해서 우리 국내 스포츠 산업 부분도 대량 수업 그리고 폐업 이런 것들이 발생하고 있습니다. 그래서 아마 우리 많은 스포츠 중소기업들 그런 경영 한계 내몰렸다고 볼 수가 있고요. 통계에 따르면 스포츠 산업체 폐업률이 코로나 이전은 0.24%였는데 코로나 이후에는 0.5%로 2배 이상 수직 상승한 것으로 보고가 되고 있습니다. 코로나19와 스포츠 영향으로서 신체 활동 그리고 국민의 건강을 이어가고 있다는 통계 자료가 나오고 있습니다. 지금 스포츠 시설업과 서비스업의 휴업, 폐업 이런 것은 또 국민의 스포츠 활동을 줄어들게 만드는 요인이 됩니다. 2017년 이후에 줄곧 상승세를 보여왔던 국민생활 참여율 이것은 2020년 기준으로 봤을 때 주 1회 이상 또 한 번 운동할 경우에 30분 이상 이게 규칙적으로 생활체육에 참여한 비율을 우리가 그 통계로 관리를 하고 있는데 2020년에는 60.2%에서 전년 대비 5.5% 처음으로 하락을 했습니다. 그래서 또 감소세에 있었던 스포츠에 미참여하는 비율이 3.6% 이렇게 늘어나는 등 스포츠 활동이 굉장히 큰 비율로 축소되고 있다는 것이 통계로 나타나고 있고요. 또 학교 등교가 또 이렇게 중단되는 등 해서 학교 체육을 통해서 신체 활동을 그나마 유지하던 유청소년들의 스포츠 활동이 크게 축소되고 있어서 우리 청소년이 자라나는 성장기에 있는 청소년들의 신체 발달에도 영향을 크게 미칠 걸로 예상이 되고 있습니다. 이러한 신체 활동의 축소는 건강의 정진뿐만 아니라 정신적인 문제 이런 것도 이어집니다. 코로나19로 해서 일상에 큰 변화가 닥쳐 우울감이나 무력감 등이 생기는 코로나19도 신종용어가 생기고 있는 것이 이런 현실을 방증하는 사례라고 볼 수 있습니다. 코로나19와 스포츠 그러면 앞으로 어떤 방향으로 좀 이 부분을 우리가 풀어나가야 될 것인가 한번 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 코로나19 상황 속에서 최근에 이제 도쿄 하계 올림픽이 막을 내렸죠. 우리나라는 이런 올림픽과 아주 굉장히 각별한 인연이 있습니다. 오늘도 88서울올림픽 기념 32회 우리 국제학술대회 인가는 1988년 하계 서울올림픽 그리고 3년 전에 2018년 평창 동계올림픽을 저희가 양대 올림픽을 성공적으로 치렀습니다. 그리고 2024년에는 평창 강원 유스 올림픽이 동계올림픽이 열리게 되어 있습니다. 지금 올림픽 유산으로서 제가 좀 전에 레거시 말씀을 드렸습니다는 서울올림픽 기념 국민체육진흥공단이 설립 위해서 우리나라 국민 체육 활동을 위한 기금을 통해서 국민 스포츠 활동에 대한 재정 지원을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이런 것을 봤을 때 우리 올림픽을 통해서 우리 레거시 차원에서 우리 스포츠에 대한 어떤 시스템이 갖춰져 있다고 볼 수 있습니다. 그런 점에서 올림픽 정신, 올림피즘 이런 부분이 우리 한국 스포츠에서는 굉장히 중요한 어떤 한 부분을 차지하고 있다 이렇게 이야기도 과언이 아니겠습니다. 올림픽 무브먼트, 올림픽 운동 관련해서 올림픽 현장에 기재되어 있는 것을 보면 크게 6가지 전략적인 올림피즘이 추구를 하는데 여기는 보면 모두 위한 스포츠, 신체 스포츠를 통한 평화, 스포츠를 통한 개발, 여성과 스포츠, 스포츠를 통한 교육, 스포츠 환경 등이 포함됩니다. 그래서 이런 올림피즘은 우리 서울올림픽의 레거시의 큰 한 부분이 아닌가 이렇게 생각됩니다. IOC에 따르면 이제 스포츠 올림픽 추구하고 있는 핵심 가치는 크게 3가지라고 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 탁월성, 엑셀런스, 그리고 우정, 프렌십, 존중, 리스펙트 이 3가지를 IOC가 제시를 하고 있는데요. 이런 것은 또 우리 올림픽 대회와 유스 올림픽의 크게 3가지 부분이기도 합니다. 먼저 엑셀런스, 탁월성과 관련해서는 이것은 이렇게 전문 체육, 엘리트 체육에만 해당이 되는 것이 아니라 우리 각자의 생활 영역에서 최선을 다해 나가는 그런 모습을 우리가 지향하는 것이라고 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 그래서 이런 참가의 중요성, 또 진보하는 것의 중요성, 또 신체 의식으로 마음의 조화로운 건강을 즐기는 것 등의 중요성을 다 함께 내포하는 것이라고 볼 수 있겠습니다. 우정에 관해서, 프렌십에 관해서는 이것은 올림픽이 정치적, 경제적, 성적, 인종적, 종교적 이런 어떤 다름을 극복하는 인류애를 전파해 나가자는 측면을 볼 수가 있고요. 이것은 이제 또 올림픽의 가치, 정신이 지향하고 있는 스포츠를 통한 평화와도 연결된다고 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 올림픽의 또 다른 가치, 존중은 굉장히 저는 이 리스펙트 이 부분은 우리 올림픽 정신의 굉장히 중요한 부분이 부분의 하나가 아닌가 생각합니다. 자기 자신 또 자신의 신체에 대한 존중과 더불어 다른 사람 규칙과 규정 그리고 스포츠와 환경에 대한 존중을 의미합니다. 특히 이제 우리나라도 다문화 시대에 접어들었고요. 세계 시민으로서의 스포츠를 통해서 타인을 존중하고 배려한 것을 우리가 스포츠를 통해서 우리가 교육하고 또 이런 어떤 성숙된 시민사회 정신을 함양해 나갈 수 있다고 생각을 합니다. 코로나19 이전에 우리는 글로벌 경제 환경의 교체에 따라서 선진국과 저개발국 그리고 스포츠 향유 여건의 차이가 극명하고 또 여기에 동반적 사회적 인식의 차이가 또 더해져서 스포츠 활동 향유가 인류의 모두의 기본적 권리라는 사실 이것을 소홀히 했다고 할 수가 있겠습니다. 이제는 코로나19 이후에는 글로벌 시민 모두의 관계가 똑같이 다가온 이 제약이 스포츠와 신체 활동의 가치를 다시금 깨닫게 하는 계기가 되었다고 생각합니다. 우리 모두가 누려왔던 정말 일상적인 야외 활동과 신체 활동이 우리 삶에 아주 중요한 부분이었다는 것을 우리가 알게 되었죠. 이제 이러한 전제하에서 우리 스포츠의 어떤 가치, 스포츠 코로나19 시대에 우리 스포츠의 방향에 대해서 우리 또 서울올림픽 국민체육공단이 진행하는 걸 중심으로 해서 저희가 몇 가지 한번 말씀해 볼까 합니다. 코로나19 시대 스포츠 방향에 대해서 이제 올림픽 정신 부분에 제가 한번 언급을 했고요. 두 번째로는 이제 저희는 스포츠 뉴딜을 통해서 저희 국민체육진흥공단은 국민의 건강한 삶을 지원하는 부분에 저희가 초점을 맞춰서 정책을 추진하고 있다는 것을 한번 소개를 좀 해드릴 겁니다. 저명한 여성학자, 여성경제학자 모니카 블레가 이런 말을 했습니다. 스포츠 산업 에서의 손실과 영향을 최소화시키기 위해서는 직접적으로 코로나19의 영향을 받은 부분에 대한 지원이 이루어져야 된다. 그리고 여기에는 스포츠, 레저, 관광 등이 포함된다. 그리고 정부 지원 방향으로서는 우리 이 스포츠 산업 부분에 유동성 공급이라든지 신용융자, 그리고 재정 지원, 감세 등이 있습니다. 우리는 이것을 스포츠 뉴딜이라고 저희가 명명을 했습니다. 국민체육진흥공단은 스포츠 코로나19 발생한 작년부터 해서 저희가 스포츠 산업의 회복을 통해서 총력을 기울이고 있습니다. 스포츠 코로나19 위기 극복 지원단을 구성을 해서 저희가 매주 저희가 체크를 하고 점검하고 추가 경정 예산을 4차례 편성해서 3천억 이상을 확보를 해서 다각도로 지금 지원을 하고 있습니다. 매주 저희가 집행 진도를 체크하면서 우리 코로나19로 정말 어려운 스포츠 산업 현장에 대한 지원을
점검해 나가고 있다는 말씀드립니다. 여기에 있는 주요 사업으로는 스포츠 기업에 대한 원스톱 금융 지원, 그리고 스포츠 중소기업의 사업 자금 지원, 그리고 코로나19 시대에 우리가
비대면 코칭 시장의 활성화 지원, 그리고 코로나19로 많은 기업들이 폐업을 했습니다는 이런 기업의 재기 지원, 그리고 지금 실내 체육 시설이 많이 문을 닫았습니다는 이런 실내 체육 시설에서 새롭게 지도자를 고용하는 고용 안정화 지원 사업들에서 한 3천억의 추경 예산을 확보해서 지원하고 있다는 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 우리가 국민체육진흥공단은 또 정부 기조인 K-뉴딜을 스포츠 환경에 적극 활용해서 뉴딜 혁신 추진 계획을 수립해서 저희가 ES 경영과 함께 추진해 오고 있습니다. 스포츠의 디지털 뉴딜 부분은 저희가 앞으로 코로나19 이후에 어떤 디지털 전환을 통해서 스마트 체육 서비스의 강화를 의미한다고 볼 수 있습니다. 과학적인 체력 측정, 그리고 운동 처방 서비스, 국민 체력 100의 비대면 라이프 스타일을 반영하고 또 온라인 원격 서비스를 도입하는 등 직접 우리 체력인증센터를 방문하지 않더라도 누구나 집에서 양질의 운동 스포츠 콘텐츠를 소비할 수 있는 환경을 만들려고 하고 있습니다. 또 저희가 가치 있는 체육 데이터를 발굴하고 개방하는 취지로 체육 종합 빅데이터 센터를 구축해서 90억 중에 체육 융합 데이터를 제공하는 것도 스포츠의 디지털 뉴딜을 위한 경제 활성화에 도움이 될 것으로 저희가 보고 있습니다. 스포츠 산업 뉴딜 분야에 있어서는 저희가 차세대 성장 동력 활성화를 위해 스포츠 대상 기업의 경영 토털 서비스를 제공하는 스포츠 종합산업 지원센터를 금년 2월에 개소를 했습니다. 올림픽 공원에 개소를 했고요. 올해 또 일산에 또 추가를 광명에도 개소를 했고 일산에도 추가로 개소를 준비를 하고 있습니다. 이런 스포츠 종합 지원센터는 입주 공간 지원에서부터 법률, 특허, 재무, 해외 판로 등 전문가 상담과 제품 전시 홍보, 기업 간의 협업과 네트워크 등 서비스를 종합적으로 지원하는 센터가 되겠습니다. 아울러서 저희가 민간 체육시설과 고객을 1대1로 연결해주는 비대면 전용 플랫폼인 키핏을 금년 3월에 오픈해서 비대면 코칭 시장의 활성화를 저희가 도모하고 있습니다.
이와 함께 또 내실 있는 서비스 운영을 위해서 1,800명의 전문 인력을 양성하고 1,200개의 비대면 스포츠 코칭 사업 전환을 지원함으로써 앞으로 향후 코로나19 시대에 온라인 스포츠 코칭 시대를 저희가 앞당길 예정으로 추진하고 있다는 말씀을 드립니다. 또 저희가 그린 뉴딜과 ESG 경영의 일환으로 체육시설 같은 경우에도 저희가 안전한 그 친환경, 신재생 에너지를 활용해서 저희가 제로 에너지 기술을 활용한 친환경 국민체육센터를 2024년까지 65개를 전국에 걸쳐 순차적으로 신설해서 우리가 탄소 중립 국가, 중립 실인이라는 국가적 목표에 저희도 스포츠 분야가 기여하려고 하고 있습니다. 이제 마무리를 짓도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 정말 뜻깊은 제32회 서울올림픽 88서울올림픽 국제학술대회 코로나19로 정말 어려운 새로운 어떤 우리 환경에서의 스포츠의 방향을 저희가 모색하고 있습니다. 이 코로나19를 넘어서서 저는 우리 스포츠계가 올림픽 우리 이 학술대회를 통해서 올림픽의 어떤 가치를 새롭게 발굴하고 스포츠 정신을 다시 한번 우리가 내재하는 그런 계기로 좀 삼았으면 좋겠다. 이런 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶고요. 두 번째로는 이 어려운 상황 속에서 정말 우리 스포츠 산업 현장이 붕괴되고 있는 이런 현장에서 우리 스포츠 산업을 구조 조정하고 또 재생시키고 또 미래지향적인 새로운 방향으로 좀 우리가 또 육성하는 그런 스포츠 산업의 육성과 부활이라는 두 가지 키워드를 제시를 할까 합니다. 여러분들도 잘 아시다시피 스포츠 올림픽의 가치는 국민 개개인이 글로벌 시민 의식을 함양하고 글로벌 상생에 더 나은 삶을 추구하는 것을 의미합니다. 스포츠는 이러한 삶의 큰 기쁨이기도 하고 동시에 이런 삶을 구현하는 데 있어서 굉장히 중요한 수단이기도 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 여러분 다 아시다시피 모든 세계 많은 국가들에서는 스포츠와 올림픽의 긍정적인 레거시를 활용해서 당면한 사회적인 문제와 과제를 해결하고 또 산업을 육성하는 정책을 추진하고 있습니다. 코로나19라는 이런 초유의 상황 속에서도 우리나라 스포츠를 움직이는 많은 이해관계자들이 함께 노력을 해오고 있습니다. 그래서 저희 서울올림픽 기념 국민체육공단 역시 이러한 스포츠의 가치 확산을 위해 새로운 비전을 만들어가고 있습니다. 다음 달 9월 17일이면 서울올림픽 기념 국민체육진흥공단이 33주년 서울올림픽 기념식을 합니다. 저희 33주년 서울올림픽 기념식에서는 저희가 서울올림픽의 새로운 레거시를 앞으로 지속 가능하게 발전시켜 나가기 위한 새로운 비전 선포식을 저희가 준비를 하고 있습니다. 우리 한국체육학회 우리 전문가 여러분들의 많은 관심과 또 응원을 부탁을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 이제 스포츠는 우리 사회에서 하나의 퍼포먼스가 아니라 중요한 삶의 가치이자 동력으로 그리고 산업적인 측면에서도 이제 아주 결정적인 우리가 역할을 할 그런 시기가 되었습니다. 스포츠는 각 정부 부처의 주요 사업 및 글로벌 지속가능 발전 목표 SDG와 긴밀히 연계하고 또 ESG를 실천하는 중요 매개체로서의 역할을 앞으로 충실히 해 나가야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 이러한 과정에서 스포츠 산업의 제도약 역시 기회를 잡을 수 있을 것이라고 생각합니다. 올림픽 가치를 지속 가능 개발 목표에 매칭하는 큰 틀에서 정부의 각 부처 사업에 스포츠가 기여할 수 있는 영역을 연계하는 사업 네트워크를 구조화한다면 스포츠의 가치와 스포츠 산업이 코로나19를 딛고 더불어 상생할 수 있는 아주 훌륭한 연대를 만들어낼 수 있을 것으로 기대합니다. 예, 다시 한번 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 32번째 학술대회 개최를 축하드리면서 코로나19를 넘어서 우리 스포츠계가 스포츠 올림픽의 가치를 확산하고 스포츠 산업을 다시 한번 재도약시킬 수 있는 그런 기회를 맞아서 위기 속에서 기회를 찾는 그런 지혜를 발휘하는 좋은 국제학술대회가 되기를 소망합니다. 감사합니다.
조현재 이사장님의 기조 강연 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 오늘의 다양한 발제를 진행하기에 앞서서 그 최초 행사 일정을 다소 변경해서 지금부터 약 20분간의 휴식 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 20분간의 휴식 시간 이후에는 오늘 예정돼 있었던 6개의 발제들을 순서대로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 20분 후에 뵙도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 시간이 되었으므로 행사를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 자, 다음 행사는 오늘 행사의 첫 번째 발제입니다. 첫 번째 발제는 Physical Activity for People with Disabilities in COVID-19 Era, Case of Seoul National University Program 이라는 주제로 서울대학교의 이용호 교수님께서 진행해 주시도록 하겠습니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 방금 소개받은 서울대학교 이용호입니다. 오늘 이렇게 큰 자리에서 발제를 하게 돼서 영광으로 생각하고요. 오늘 발제는 코로나 시대의 장애인 체육이라는 주제로 발제를 할 텐데요. 서울대학교에서 했던 장애인 체육 프로그램을 위주로 케이스를 소개하는 걸로 발제를 진행하려고 합니다. 오늘 발표는 미흡하지만 영어로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great honor to talk about my topic, physical activities for people with disabilities during the pandemic. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of general aspects of physical activity for people with disabilities, and I'm going to introduce you to a case of Seoul National University physical activity program for kids with disabilities. COVID-19 pandemic has changed pretty much everything our daily lives. Schools got shut down. People lost opportunities to engage in activities requiring social interactions. Sports facilities got closed, and many other social activities have been restricted by the pandemic. For people with disabilities, the situation has gotten even worse, has become a more serious problem. Family members who have kids with disabilities suffer greatly because the daycare service has been closed down, no daycare services available, and lack of opportunities to engage in structured exercise and social activities has led to lots of other health-related problems. So this has created lots of even added problems for families who have kids with disabilities. And in addition to that, I heard about news story that families who have kids with disabilities have committed suicide due to increased level of stress raising their kids without daycare services. So, how it might end? People are talking about herd or community immunity, vaccination, weakening of coronavirus, or new version like Delta version or Lambda version of mutation of coronavirus, or even next version, new version of COVID-2N might even occur. So what can we do? Can we really do anything to stop the pandemic as an educator or service provider? Maybe not. Then what we really need to do is to improve, to strengthen our ability to adapt to ever-changing environment, such as universal design for teaching. This is the idea that I borrowed from the concept of universal design for learning. So teacher becomes flexible so they can teach under any circumstances regardless of teaching environment, at the gym or classroom. So, in order to do that, there should be paradigm changes because the current one is not going to work. We have witnessed many paradigm changes in education, from conventional learning to active learning paradigm to even online using Zoom, online learning paradigm. Now, online learning is no longer new paradigm of learning nowadays. This does not just happen in education, in classrooms. This paradigm change has happened in every aspect of our daily life, such as religious activity and many other social activities, something like this, as you can see in the screen. Especially technology has contributed a great deal in paradigm changes in this contemporary society. Guess what? The blackboard once was a great educational invention in the history of educational technology. Ever since, many technology-assisted tools have been invented, developed, and used in education. This now no longer looks strange in the classroom. This is actually what I'm really doing in front of your screen. For kids now, this is very normal and not even considered new normal for them. This is very natural environment and natural educational setting for kids. And teachers are getting better at this. So their teaching is now even evolving around online learning or Zoom learning environment. Artificial intelligence technology has been widely used in sport, such as Internet of Things, virtual reality, and augmented reality. This is the famous character, one of the main characters in a popular comic book called Dragon Ball. This character, the name of character is Vegeta. What he wears here is the called Scouter that identifies opponent's strength. Guess what? This technology actually has been realized and applied in sports settings, especially in soccer. You can see the head coach of Atletico Madrid football team in Spanish league. What he wears here is Google glasses that transmit and receive in play information during the match. So this may be a new paradigm for sports in general. Now, for physical activity for people with disabilities, what would or should a new paradigm look like? This conventional physical activity may no longer be available at this difficult time. So, would the new paradigm look like this for people with disability for their physical activity? It's a very typical online format physical activity program. Or something like this. This is the more advanced technology and more interactive way of doing exercise by using that kind of technology. And I hope this doesn't volume up. And anything like this is what we have in our laboratory at Seoul National University. So these are all supported by technology and available in online format. Now, however, what is would miss out, or what we would miss out though, is human interaction. This is one of the moments with my students in marathon event. How can we do this in online format? How about sense of membership and accomplishment? This was the one of the greatest moments when our students actually competed in the official event of Special Olympics Korea for the very first time, where we are placed in second place. Well, actually, just 3 teams participate. But who cares? They participated, they experienced the world. That's all that matters, right? So how can you do that in online format? How about inclusive physical activity? We are talking more about, many people are talking about inclusion, importance of inclusion. How can you accomplish to share sense of community without physical inclusion? So, new paradigm of physical activity for people with disability is not just delivery of class content or program content through online, but it should be a new learning modality. So what it should look like? Should it be online or offline? Somebody said, how about online? Both online and offline. Well, somebody told me that why we should stick to either online or offline. Either one has both a benefit and disadvantage. We can take best of each approach, right? So-called all-line approach. For physical activity, we have used the term contact, and untact. I know it's broken Korean English, but it makes very good sense, right? So before COVID-19 era, the physical activity in general was contact. During the COVID-19, it's been untact, right? After COVID-19, what it should be? What should it be? Is it contact or untact? How about just like online approach? How about untact? Just you take a good combination of both contact and untact, right? Taking best of each approach. Just we need to stop arguing whether it should be offline or online. So what has been done so far? Well, we have a very, very long way to go. But very fortunately, we started anyway at Seoul National University. So today, what I would like to do is to show you and to introduce you to a case of Seoul National University Physical Activity Program for kids with disabilities during this pandemic. We have two different weekly community outreach service programs offering twice a week. Every Tuesday, we provide physical activity for kids with disabilities, and the name of each program is called SNU Fun and Kick. We call it SNU Fun and Kick. It was, during the pandemic, it was offered as an untact program. And the other one we have is sponsored by City of Siheung, and it's part of our College of Education community supporting education program called SNUCOM program. So the SNUCOM program in our the program was offered as all-text format. Well, it wasn't really true all-text format. It's semi or quasi-structured all-text program. So I'm going to show you each of the program we implemented at Seoul National University. First, SNU Fun and Kick as untact. As you can see in the slide, the program followed original format of this flow chart, and it was delivered exactly the same in untact format. So this was actually an upgraded version of our online program having chroma key in the background. Before that, we didn't even have the chroma key background. We just had a camera. Then ever since we added a piece of technology as we progresses. So this is not the most current one. We have the more technology assisted tool for our online format program. This is a fitness exercise, but for fitness exercise, we had a little bit of problem since most of kids living in the apartment. As you can see, kids are jumping at their house. So there was complaints, so there was something to consider to improve the program. Nevertheless, it looked fine as far as program effects are concerned. This is rhythmic exercise. Since space and social interaction are limited, we tried various thematic activities, introducing different cultural activities with their cultural meaning and information. So kids stay interested and connected. And it was a very good opportunity for them to learn about other cultures while they are doing physical activity. This activity, 5 motor skill activity, required 5 motor skills and manual dexterity. So this was a bit of a challenging one for the kids. So we divided group into 2 different groups based on their skill levels, thanks to Zoom's multi-room function. So what you see now is the high functioning kids, and what you see now is lower functioning kids. So we provide different level of instruction based on their skill level, thanks to technological assistance. Lastly, massage wraps up the activities of the day. So this was exactly what we really did from offline or regular format of program in online format during the pandemic. Now, on the other hand, I said we have 2 different community outreach services program. On the other hand, Student camp program was delivered both online and offline as needed basis. This was not really a true all-tech program, but required resiliency, ability to be able to switch from one to another, right? So 1 week program was offered online, then other weeks program, the situation got worse and we were required to switch from offline to online and vice versa. So this process has helped our student staff to improve their ability and their resiliency to be able to adapt to ever-changing teaching environment. So we started off offline program, then switched it to online, as you can see. The left-hand column shows regular offline program, then it was switched to online program as situation became worse. Lastly, we use smartphone application. So we communicated through this application with parents. Parents ask the question and we provide them with feedback after all the activity is done for the day. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a short video clip of how we did in hybrid of online and offline program for people for kids with disabilities. It's only it's not really short, 3.5 minutes video clip. I hope you all enjoy.
주범이 잘하고 있어요. 현욱이 굿. 예송이. 예송아 중간에 그렇게 가는 거야? 오케이. 와, 동영이 벌써 거의 다 했어. 상비 잘하고 있고. 기훈이 이제 모았다가 그렇지. 오케이. 자, 시간
Okay, this is it, and we also did research on this, so we completed all the research. Hopefully, you will see the result of our research within this year, and also our program has been upgraded. So what I said in all-text format, true all-text approach to new paradigm of physical activity for people with disabilities will be available, hopefully will be available shortly, so everyone can have an access to a new paradigm of flexible activity, regardless of any situation and circumstances. Thank you very much.
예, 이용호 교수님의 발제 진심으로 감사드립니다. 그러면 두 번째 발제를 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 발제는 COVID-19 Sport and Networks라는 주제로 유니버시티 오브 리버풀의 데니얼 파너 교수님께서 준비해 주신 영상으로 발제를 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다.
Okay, hello everyone. First off, thank you for the invitation to speak from Kian Kim on behalf of the Korean Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation and Dance. I've been asked to talk about COVID, sport and networks, and in doing so I'm going to give a little bit of insight in some of the research and some of the things that I've seen taking place in sport over the past year or so. To give an introduction to myself, my name is Dan Parnell. I'm an associate professor at the University of Liverpool and sit within the management school at the university. I deliver on the football industry's MBA and on a MSc in sport, business and management. I also teach on the LMA, League Managers Association diploma, and a number of different football qualifications delivered by stakeholders in the game. I'm also head of football research at Dundee United Football Club that sit within the Scottish Premiership, and I'm chief exec of the Association of Sporting Directors. That is an international organisation that aims to support, connect and develop senior leaders within football. So within those roles, I'm engaged in a number of practice-based elements and industry-focused roles. At the same time, I'm involved in a lot of research too. So today's presentation, it will give a bit of an examination and a bit of foundations around relationships and how we've tried to make sense of what's gone on during COVID. We're then looking a little bit more detail at the UEFA European Championships 2020 and the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And I'll provide some reflections around some of the research findings, what we found, and some personal observations around what I've seen. In order to give some foundations, I wanted to talk about this idea of the structure of sport. In doing that, we talk about sport worlds. The group of people and researchers that I work with, we talk about football worlds and sport worlds. And we're inspired by the work of Howard Becker, who did this masterful piece on art worlds. And it's that when we look at sport, we view it as an ecosystem or a network of individuals that have a division of labour that contribute to making something happen. So in Howard Becker's work, in our work, we talk about people being involved in the process of construction, often in large numbers, working in collective action in a series of different steps and processes with a predefined but always in flux set of conventions, mostly but not always with a clear division of labour. So this social organisation of cultural production is not just an interest of Howard Becker and now ours, but Nick Crossley drew heavily upon this when he studied relational sociology. So we're going to give like an insight into that, and I wanted to give an insight into that at the start, just to lay the foundations of how we've approached our understanding of COVID and what we think has taken place. So when COVID hit very early on, and you see from this article, I believe we published it in that first month where it affected us within England, so I'm based within England. and I'm based within Liverpool in the northwest of England. So what we wanted to do, we were struggling with the pandemic personally and professionally, as everyone else would have felt that globally. At the same time, we found it quite useful and reassuring to discuss what we've seen and what we found and to write about it. So we weren't intent on trying to churn out research in the case of a pandemic, but we found a lot of energy and enthusiasm from talking and trying to make sense of what was going on, and working with our colleagues. And as you all know, when you collaborate with people, there's a lot of benefits from working together, because you don't just talk about research, you talk about personal and professional stuff, and it helps you help make sense of what was going on. So we wrote about COVID and networks and sport with a particular focus on what was going on with events, and particularly mega events. As part of that, we wanted to look at, now I want to give a little bit of context of what's gone on with sport. So we've seen a proliferation of new content built in multi-million-pound TV broadcasting deals. Why is this important? Because sport contains a lot of money. That means there's a lot of stakeholders that want a return on that investment. There's been a lot of live broadcasts. There's been an increased prevalence in pay-per-view opportunities. Football itself, so football is my main sport, is broadcast in over 200 countries, and it's a multi-billion pound global audience, okay? And there's also been new technologies that have swept sport to capture new audiences. And that kind of set some of the scene of what was going on as I would say, the pandemic hit. When we look at society, we need to recognize that it is globalized, networked, and interdependent. And we've all seen this in sport and away from sport, and how the pandemic and various lockdowns, travel restrictions have actually impacted not just our sport, but our way of life. It's thrown up huge challenges. In the absence of any drug or vaccine at that time, we needed to reduce any burden on the health systems that operated within our regions and within our countries. So mass gatherings and gatherings in sport under the threat of the virus was potentially had this super spreader potential. So the 2020 Summer Olympics and the Euro 2020 Championships were two such events, but we were also conscious of what went on the ground, those grassroots or community gatherings. These were the things that interested us at the start of lockdown through to now. So what were the responses to COVID? So we've seen cancelled or suspended events. We've seen social distant measures, travel restrictions, quarantines, even changes in funeral services and just to reduce crowd sizes. And we've also seen, or what should have seen, is clear communication from national and international health authorities to ensure that verified information and that fake news does not get out, to prevent rumours and panic. Now, in all but the final point that I made, I think we've had various levels of progress and situations. Within the UK at the minute, we've got an easing of social distancing, an easing on travel restrictions and quarantine and testing. And we seem to be coming out of this situation in a positive position. However, we're very aware that there's been a real absence of clear decision-making at the top of our government. You will have your own experiences from the countries in which you reside on the effectiveness of your government's decision-making, sport decision-making, and then what consequence that's had on your communities. But undoubtedly, people who watch this presentation have been personally affected by COVID and may have lost loved ones, and it's been an extremely challenging and tough time. Anyone that has had COVID will have experienced the challenges that it presents. So when we looked at this in March 2020, we had an event ahead of us, and now the event was the European Championships in 2020. Now the fixtures were meant to celebrate the Eurozone. Now, despite this, the UK government were on the way to leaving the Eurozone, which you will have heard about Brexit, undoubtedly. However, the tournament was, I think it was the 16th competition in its 60th year. It was a celebration of free movement across the Eurozone, and it was meant to not only celebrate the fact that we had lots of fantastic different countries in Europe and to create travel and enterprise, it was also to reduce the financial risk on any one nation hosting a mega event. However, this biggest strength that it had at the start of the tournament in a pandemic became its Achilles heel and its biggest weakness. So during any pandemic, clearly there needs to be reduced travel to ease the burden and reduce the risk of placing increased infections and an increased burden on local health services. So viruses and outbreaks have happened before, and we've operated our sport events during this time. So we've had the influenza pandemic during the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics and 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa. We've had the Ebola virus, the Zika virus, and all these events have been delivered successfully despite the general public health outcomes associated with mega events. And while we view mega events as generally being a positive thing and healthy event, the reality is that we also have a couple of negative health consequences of having these events. So FIFA for the Brazil World Cup made the government change national legislation to allow alcohol and Budweiser to be served within stadiums, which would be viewed as a negative health change. And there's also the transmission of sexually transmitted infections that always rise in the regions that events take place. So clearly, if there's a virus, any transfer of people is a real risk for any host nation. The question that challenged those decision makers was to postpone or not. Now, the Euro 2020 Championships was a networked competition, so it created a huge problem. There was much critique on the delay of the Olympic Games, and the chair of the IOC, the president of the IOC, came out and said, there is no plan B. We will go ahead with the Summer Olympics in 2020. Now, clearly on reflection, we know that that did not take place, and that was the same approach he took this year. However, on the 13th of March in 2020, all football authorities postponed elite football. First, they postponed it until the 3rd of April, then the 30th of April, then it was indefinitely. Other events within the UK took place. So the Cheltenham Festival, a huge horse racing event that attracts over 60,000 people, took place between the 16th and 19th of March. This was after football was postponed. On the 16th, all grassroots football, community football was postponed. And then we start to see other things take place. So the Formula One Grand Prix season was postponed, the Six Nations Rugby Championship, and one of the most watched historic famous sporting events in the world, the horse racing Grand National event 2020 in Aintree, was cancelled. So Aintree is also in Liverpool, so a massive event to be cancelled. And that was the question and the decision that faced many event organisers, was to postpone or cancel. And obviously, when they make these decisions, they have a number of stakeholders to consider. Part of doing this is risk management. So we're really interested in risk management. So in McCloskey et al., they provided updated recommendations really quickly for dealing with COVID-19. And this guidance, endorsed by and support provided by the World Health Organization, provided these general considerations that people should think about. So COVID-specific considerations, an action plan for COVID-19 specifically, and a decision is made to proceed with a mass gathering. Measures and planners should consider risk communication, community engagement, and risk mitigation strategies. So we started off trying to develop tools to not just manage risk, but to help inform decision making. Obviously, these events had a number of costs if you cancel them or you go ahead of them. That could be both human and financial. The postponement of the Euros was an estimated cost of 300 million and a revenue lost to the European top 5 leagues at around 4.14 billion. So when you talk about the cost of just one football tournament and then one set of football leagues in Europe, so the top 5 football leagues, you could see the routine in this ecosystem, in this football world, was severely affected. Now, this was the same for grassroots sport and for other elite sports. The ecosystem had undoubtedly been affected and changed. The Euro Championships clearly did not take place in 2020. They were postponed until 2021. So we had Euro 2020 and 2021. In blue, you can see our original network, and you could see how connected the different locations, the 12 different cities were, and how people would travel between these cities. However, Euro 2020 and 21, the actual tournament, still had a lot of transport of people. And this undoubtedly had a consequence for different people. So was the event delivered successfully? Well, that depends who you are. For tournament organisers, they would have loved, and sponsors, they would have loved the 60,000, 40,000, 60,000 people in Wembley. They would have loved cities and stadiums being full again. But they would have also loved the climax on penalties and the excitement that goes with it. But what they would have also seen is the transport of fans of people, huge increases from when we'd recently been in lockdown. And with one match, so when Scotland played England at Wembley, I travelled down from Scotland on trains with Scotland fans. It was extremely busy. London was extremely busy. Glasgow was extremely busy. And one report in The Athletic said that Euro 2020 could be linked to almost 2,000 Scottish COVID cases. What we probably seen during that point is that there was a lot less reporting around the impact of these events on COVID and more reporting around the spectacle and the magic of football. However, there's undoubtedly that's going to come at a cost to national health services and no doubt had an impact on people's lives. We could argue that the Olympic Games was slightly more serious by the very nature that we are talking about more people and more countries being involved. We recently published a new paper in Managing Sport and Leisure, and it's called Redesigning the Games, the 2020 Olympic Games Playbooks and New Sport Event Risk Management Tools. So we explored what was then the forthcoming Olympic Games in Tokyo and the impact COVID had on risk management processes. And in doing this, we look back to some of the events that have been staged throughout the mid and late 2020 and early 21 to see what kind of emerging practices we might identify in terms of risk management and safety. So in the paper itself, we've tried to provide some emerging lessons around risk management. So when we looked at some of these events, and here's just a selection of different events between January, March 2021. We've had different strategies such as closed doors and periods with no spectators or only a few spectators. So we might have a football ground that can host 40,000 people, but only 2,000 people have been allowed in. We've seen handball championships behind closed doors. We've seen 30% stadium capacities for the Super Bowl, 25,000 people in for the Super Bowl and the 65,000 people stadium. We've seen the Australia Open that changed during that period, and then we've seen the Nordic World Ski Championships behind closed doors. So events have been affected in many different ways. So to provide some concluding thoughts, and I recommend picking up the paper that is open access, is the financial and economic fallout from COVID-19 on professional and mass participation sport could be catastrophic, and I don't think we totally know what impact that has had yet. Making use of technology has been central to developing and protecting commercial revenue, but also the safety of people entering tournaments. The foundation of sport will be and has been tested. However, we will need to reflect on this more and what we've done, the decisions that we've made in the future before we can come to any genuine conclusions. Capitalising on the change in values, demands and tastes and preferences provides an opportunity for new innovations to bring in different types of revenues. So when you're in a sports club, professional sports club, and you can't bring fans to your ground, then you need to think of different strategies to engage your fans and customers. And we're probably the state a player would describe as that is COVID mitigated rather than COVID safe. And whilst I feel a little bit safer now, we're very aware that COVID is alive and it is real. When I reflect on leaders in sport and society, I'm drawn to this picture. And the pictures of during the Second World War, the soldiers would carry donkeys, and it's not because they loved the donkeys or they wanted to rest their legs. It's because if they let a donkey wander around without any guidance, is that they're likely to kill other people and set off mines. And the moral of the story is that during difficult times, the first ones you have to keep under control is the jackasses. It's the silly people that don't understand the danger and do as they please. And I believe some of our leaders in sport and society haven't been guided. We haven't got them under control because they are in control and they've made bad decisions for our society. Whilst we're at this point, and this image is of obviously wear a mask, wash your hands, socially distance, stay safe, and at the same time the forest fires are blazing behind them. And what I'm getting at here is that we need to step back from sport and we need to try and ask questions around what is important in the here and now. And ultimately, we need to do better. Sport is a reflection of society. So when we see poor leadership and poor decision making in society, we are going to see that in sport too. But we can be better. And we need to think about our initial response. And this idea by Viktor Frankl is that between stimulus and response is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. I think some of our responses have not been based on freedom, but based on commercial revenue choices, based on financial risk. And we need to understand that in sport, that there is real questions we need to ask about how we are made up, whether it is survival or whether it's versus remaining competitive. And then we need to ask about what costs that presents for us. So by means of a summary, COVID is the biggest sport industry and society shock in our lifetime, undoubtedly. The fiscal repercussions are primarily evident in the short and medium term, but we're unlikely to understand that until around 2030. Is COVID over? No, we're in a COVID mitigated state rather than a COVID safe space. And sport leaders and all leaders need to reflect on the decision-making processes and morals. From an event perspective, I think we've seen a change in the way sport events are delivered and managed. Our decision-making has changed. What we need to do once the Olympics finishes is reflect on the success and effectiveness of those games and what we can learn to ensure that we can provide safer and more enjoyable and more effective tournaments in the future for athletes, administrators, technical directors, and spectators, and more importantly, the local communities that bear the responsibility of hosting and welcoming people from all around the world in the future. I hope this presentation was of some insight and useful contribution to your day. I'm really thankful for the opportunity and hope that if anyone has any questions, they will not hesitate to get in touch. And I look forward to meeting some of you in the future. I wish you all a very healthy and safe summer with your friends, family, and loved ones. Thank you very much for your.
데니얼 파넬 교수님의 두 번째 발제, 흥미로운 발표 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 그럼 다음 발제 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 다음 발제는 Reflections on the Impact of COVID-19 on Youth Sport and Physical Activity Participation이라는 주제로 유니버시티 오브 오타와의 마라이카 탁스 교수님께서 준비해 주신 영상으로 다음 발제를 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
Good day, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you today to share some reflections on the impact of COVID-19 on youth sport and physical activity participation. First, I would like to thank the Korean Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation and Dance for their kind invitation to speak to you today. I have prepared this presentation in collaboration with one of my PhD students, Georgia Tier, who is an expert on the topic. My area of expertise is in fact on socioeconomic aspects of sports. More specifically, I examine the relationship between sports, economics, and society. Initially, my research emphasized sport participation, particularly examining social-cultural determinants of sport participation, taking a sport for all perspective. In more recent years, my research focused on the socioeconomic impact of publicly funded sport events. I bring both aspects to your attention because both foci are relevant for the purpose of this talk. Clearly, I'm not an expert in COVID-19. For all of us, the COVID-19 pandemic presented a completely new phenomenon. It created a shock globally and affected all realms of life, including sport and physical activity for youth, as well as sport events. Recent studies on COVID-19 and sport relate mainly to professional sports, sport leagues, sport events, as can be seen from the example of the recent special issue of the European Sport Management Quarterly. Studies in this issue feature professional football leagues, professional women's sports, the NBA, or are related to sport events. Studies have yet to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on sport participation and physical activity, particularly for youth. A few of the first contributions related to COVID-19 and sport participation were some commentaries in a special issue of Managing Sport and Leisure. These works have covered aspects such as sport development systems, community sports organizations and structures, and community sports for persons with disabilities. These investigations and commentaries have provided important insights into the immediate, short-term, and possibly long-term implications of community sports and structures, or for community sports systems and structures. However, an analysis of how youth participants themselves have been affected by the pandemic is still needed. Specifically, an exploration of shifting patterns and experiences of youth sport and physical activity because of COVID-19, because that can provide important insights into the future of youth sport and physical activity consumer behavior. Hence, our focus is on the impact of COVID-19 on youth sport and physical activity. So when I use the word sport participation here, I really reflect the broad notion of sport and physical activity. So not just organized sport. But this brings me back to my starting point, my initial figure. So as I said, one of my doctoral students, Georgia Tier, was going to investigate how sport events can be leveraged to stimulate participation among children. In her research, the sport events acted as an intervention to stimulate sport participation and physical activity among youth. The two events she was going to study were the 2020 Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games in the summer of 2020, and the second event was the 2021 Canada Games, to be hosted in Niagara, Ontario in the summer of 2021. Of course, both events were strongly affected by the pandemic and postponed by a year. This forced her to rethink her project and a parallel approach was proposed. Rather than looking at the impact of events on sport participation, she reoriented her project looking at the impact of COVID-19 on sport participation. So rather than a planned intervention, such as the sport events, the pandemic takes the role of an unplanned intervention. She took the same theoretical approach, namely social ecology theory, to understand and help examine how COVID-19 affected youth sport participation. This conceptual approach was recently published in Sustainability. Social ecology theory posits that individual behavior is a function of the social, cultural, and built environments. It assumes that there are 5 levels in society. Public policy at the political level, which refers to laws and policies at the local, provincial, and national levels, such as physical education policies. Community level factors, such as the broader informal networks, accessibility of space and facilities to participate in sports, for example, urban communities or rural communities. Institutional level factors describe the institutions with organizational characteristics that affect an individual, such as offerings at local community sports centers or local sports clubs in a region. Then there is the interpersonal level, which is the individual's immediate interaction with others. And finally, the intrapersonal factors, which originate in the individual and reflect youth's preferences and past experiences with sports, for example. The forced pause by COVID-19 requires reflection, and social ecology theory provides a comprehensive framework to guide an exploration of the impacts of the pandemic on youth sport and physical activity. And so socio-ecological theory was used to explore the following 2 research questions. What is or are the potential impacts of COVID-19 on changing youth sport and physical activity preferences and trends? And how can potential shifts in future youth sport participation trends affect sport and physical activity providers in their future offerings? So before diving into the potential shifts initiated by the pandemic, let's consider the youth sport and physical activity trends prior to COVID-19. Youth sport participation trends prior to COVID-19 indicated a gradual shift in preferences from organized, such as club and team sports, to non-organized sports, such as informal pickup participation or spontaneous play and setting. And from formal, traditional, mainstream sports, such as hockey, baseball, basketball, to more non-traditional sports, or more unique sports such as rock climbing or skateboarding. So this was already happening pre-pandemic. So then how did COVID-19 affect youth sport and physical activity during the pandemic? Here you see a quote from a recent report by the Canadian Women in Sports Alliance, reflecting a quote from a 17-year-old girl who is making a statement regarding her sport participation. Basketball team practices and games canceled. Gyms closed. Can't apply for basketball scholarships. Lost chances for post-secondary scholarships and opportunities. Note that this is about organized sports and not the broader perspective of sport and physical activity, which we are discussing here. Adhering to the public health guidelines, including social distancing and staying at home, mandatory staying at home, could have led youth to do the following things. Try a different form of their favorite sport and physical activity, or try a new form of sport and physical activity in an online organized or non-organized context. Take up sport and physical activity, or stopping participating in sport and physical activity altogether. So these potential scenarios raise the question of whether these new experiences led to new future preferences. Social ecology theory can therefore help us hypothesize how these potential new experiences from youth, sport, and physical activity during the pandemic could impact future preferences, and how sport providers should respond to these shifting preferences. So, for instance, during the pandemic, at the intrapersonal level, youth experienced new ways of participating in sport and physical activity, as outlined in my previous slide. At the interpersonal level, at many points throughout the pandemic, youth were confined to their homes, shifting the social influence back to an emphasis on parents and siblings, so away from their peers, back into the nuclear family. At the institutional level, the operations of clubs would have been restricted, leading to an increase in virtual interactions and sessions online. At the community level, those in rural communities might have greater access to space for informal sport and physical activity, while those in urban areas might be limited by their lack of open spaces. At the political level, of course, we had public officials emphasizing to only leave your home for exercise. So in the following slides, I will elaborate on the implications of these new experiences for youth, physical activity, and sports participation. More specifically, we elaborate on the following 4 sport and physical activity trends in a post-COVID-19 world. Diminished participation in organized sport, but an amplified trend towards non-organized sport. Shifts in participation purposes. Reconceptualization of value from sport and physical activity. And finally, implications for sport organizations. So let's start with the first trend, diminished participation in organized sport, but an amplified trend towards non-organized sport. Well, diminished participation in organized sport was evident from a recent report from the Canadian Women's in Sports Alliance, who found that 1 in 4 Canadian girls are not committed to returning to sport post-pandemic. Note that this is about organized sport and not about sport and physical activity in broader terms. We do expect an amplified trend toward non-organized sports. We see perhaps modifications to already practiced sports. For instance, tennis. Tennis clubs were no longer to provide their programs, but we saw all the community tennis courts being used during COVID in an informal way. So youth continued to participate in tennis, but in an informal setting. Or They experience biking and hiking with their parents, and they continue this trend post-COVID. So they try new sports and continue them after COVID. We also propose that the non-organized exposure could help youth engage or perhaps re-engage who did not have a strong preference for organized sport to get back into physical activities. Also, the fact that they may prefer now less competing activities can provide this opportunity to re-engage youth that had dropped out pre-COVID. In summary, we do believe that youth may have a preference to continue participating post-pandemic in non-organized settings. The second trend, the shift in sport participation purposes. There you have the autotelic versus the instrumental purposes. Autotelic means participating as a means to an end for pleasure. Instrumental means participating for other or additional reasons such as health. Well, youth may look at informal participation giving them pleasure, appreciate sport and physical activity for health purposes. Shifts among parents can go from skill building and development that were important reasons to have their kids engaged in sport pre-pandemic to now shifts in non-organized sport for development purposes to give them something to do. So reasons for participation have shifted during the pandemic, and that may perhaps continue post-pandemic. For instance, a shift from largely focus on skill development to broader health reasons, and thus lifting some of the performance expectations of parents. The third trend, reconceptualization of values. Here we propose that sport and physical activity consumers may have created new expectations of organized sport opportunities. So new expectations can include diminishing value on competition, out of town tournaments, which require a lot of travel from the whole family or some parents, and less informal programming. This means that organizations need to rethink how to mobilize resources to provide value to their consumers and satisfying experiences. And of course, this leads into the fourth trend, looking at how sport organizations will have to adapt, or the implications for sport organizations after COVID-19. Well, they may have to rethink their programming, their marketing, and their resource management. When it comes to programming, probably less organized structures, non-league centered, drop-in programming, more introductory programming, not emphasizing competition, particularly for older ages who had lapsed from sport participation pre-pandemic. Innovative marketing, emphasize fun and spending time with friends. That's what they missed most during COVID, and sport and physical activity can bring that back to them. Skill development and exercise. And then sport organizations can also think of continuing some of the online programming, so innovation in resource management. This leads us to future research. So where do we go from here? What are some of the research questions that need further investigation? Well, how did consumers actually engage with youth sport and physical activity during the pandemic? Let's find out what they actually did. How did these experiences reshape preferences and reasons to participate in sport and physical activity in the future? How are these experiences and preferences different between youth and parents? And how did the pandemic impact the dynamics of the relationship between youth and parents? And what effect does that have on future sport participation? What are the long-term implications of COVID-19 on possible shift in preferences and subsequent shifts in consumer behavior of youth sports and physical activity? Finally, how do COVID experiences and perspectives differ for different consumer groups? For instance, families from different types of communities. We think that the experiences for youth in rural communities versus urban communities was different and therefore can have different future consequences. Families of varying socioeconomic status. And for those who participated in sport and physical activity before, during, and after the pandemic versus those who started to pick up sport and physical activity for the first time during the pandemic. Social ecology theory provides a comprehensive lens to understand the complex role of the social and built environments for families and their evolving sport and physical activity preferences. So it will be a helpful tool to investigate these research questions. Georgia Tier is embarking on these research questions, and we look forward to presenting her findings in future conferences. So in conclusion, we would like to state that the COVID-19 pandemic has acted as an unplanned intervention that has affected, and it is expected to continue to shape youth sport participation and physical activity preferences and overall trends. Specific responses are presently unknown, as specific implications of the pandemic have yet to be fully understood. Future research should continue to explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in community sport, particularly on youth sport consumer behavior. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I wish I could be here with you today to answer your questions in person. Unfortunately, the pandemic doesn't allow to be with you, neither does the time difference between our countries. But please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email myself or my graduate student, Georgia Tier, with your questions, and we will be happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure sharing these reflections with you.
마라이카 탁서 교수님의 청소년 스포츠와 신체 활동 참여에 대한 흥미로운 발표 진심으로 감사드립니다. 그럼 다음 발제는 퀸즈 유니버시티의 이은영 교수님께서 COVID-19 Physical Activity and Social Determinants of Health라는 주제로 준비해 주신 영상을 통해 발제를 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다.
Hello everyone, my name is Eun-young Lee. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Canada. I would like to thank the organizing committee of this year's International Sports Science Congress for giving me the opportunity to present some of my research work on the topics of physical activity and social determinants of health during COVID-19. In today's presentation, I will start by discussing the impact of COVID-19 on our daily lives, including changes to physical activity. I will also briefly discuss how the social determinants of health manifested during COVID-19 with the studies that my lab has conducted using data from Canada and South Korea. Then I will finish my presentation with conclusions and future recommendations. So we are all witnessing and experiencing the impact of COVID-19 on our daily normal lives. And I gotta say, it hasn't been easy for anyone. The COVID-19 pandemic and the following lockdowns and public health restrictions have negatively impacted our health behaviors. And globally, we have observed reduced physical activity, increased screen time, as well as sedentary behavior, increased alcohol consumption, and increased drug use. As well, more people are working from home, and due to school closures at different degrees by country, children and youth have been engaging in remote learning, therefore lack of opportunities for physical education classes. Moreover, health inequalities that we observed pre-pandemic have widened during the pandemic as well. So those who are already vulnerable are experiencing more challenges in many aspects of their lives. Opportunities for and participation in physical activity have also been profoundly disrupted due to the pandemic. So new public health measures to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, such as closing public spaces, including outdoor parks, playgrounds, and indoor recreational centers, have negatively impacted opportunities for participating in physical activity outdoors, as well as in public indoor spaces in all age groups, such as indoor gyms. And also school closures, it affected lack of physical education opportunities for children and youth. So such downward trend in physical activity opportunities is alarming because it has been compounded with the co-occurrence of other unhealthy behaviors, including increased alcohol consumption and substance use, and increased sedentary behavior, which has negatively impacted mental health and well-being overall. In addition, population groups that were already predisposed to being less physically active are more likely worse off now. So before we get into the details of my research project, social determinants of health is a primary tenet of my research program. So I want to briefly discuss this before we get into the details. So World Health Organization defines social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life. And Government of Canada recognizes the following variables as important social determinants of health. So that includes income and social status, employment and working conditions, education and literacy, childhood experiences, gender, culture, race, racism, disability, etc. In my recent studies examining physical activity during COVID-19, looked at the changes in physical activity and social determinants of health that have substantial impact on unfavorable changes to those behaviors. So in this presentation, I present some of the findings from 3 recent studies that my lab has conducted. So the first study that I'll briefly discuss is the study that has examined the association between social class and indoor physical activity with the immigrant status as the key variable. We used the national level cross-sectional data from 4,052 Canadians aged 25 years and older who participated in the Canadian Perspectives survey series. And a series of decision tree analysis were conducted. So we looked at the data using quantitative methods. And the primary rationale behind of this study was that in the Canadian context, immigrants may face different challenges in participating in social and health-related activities, including physical activity, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly with the upsurge of violence towards immigrants and racialized communities. And today, for the purpose of the presentation, I'll only discuss the results of outdoor physical activity. So the main result, as you can see on the left side of the slide, 72% of the Canadians reported that they participate in outdoor physical activity during the pandemic, while among immigrants, only 52% indicated that they participate in outdoor physical activity during pandemic. And here you can see in total, 68.6% reported that they participate in outdoor physical activity. So as you can see in the second row here, more Canadians reported that they participate in outdoor physical activity than immigrants. And if you see among Canadians only, those who are educated, so 79.8% reported that they participated in outdoor physical activity compared to 66.7% among those who are less educated. So among Canadians, education was a big factor in determining outdoor physical activity participation. And on the right side, as you can see, among immigrants, so 52% of the immigrants reported that they participate in outdoor physical activity. Among those who are not employed compared to employed but absent from work, or employed and work at least part of the reference week, or employed but absent work for reasons not related to COVID-19, were more likely to participate in outdoor physical activities, so 62.1% compared to 45.3%. And among those who are immigrant and those who are not currently employed, financial impact was an important factor. So those with minor or no financial impact due to COVID-19 were more likely to participate in outdoor physical activity compared to those who experienced major or moderate impact, financial impact due to COVID-19. So to summarize, in other words, the group, which population group participates in more outdoor physical activity during COVID-19, it was Canadians versus immigrants, and among Canadians, those who were educated compared to those who are less educated. But among immigrants, those who are not employed, and also those with minor or no financial impact compared to major or moderate impact, reported that they participate in more outdoor physical activity. So among Canadians and Canadian immigrants, you can see that different factors influence their participation in outdoor physical activity. So some of the conclusions from this Canadian study: disparities may exist in accessing outdoor spaces for physical activity across different social class groups during COVID-19, particularly among those who immigrated. Within the Canadian-born population group, educational attainment was a big factor. So those who were educated were more likely to participate in outdoor physical activity compared to those who were less educated. So to conclude, future research should investigate ways that could equitably promote access to outdoor physical activity during times when broad-scale stay-home orders are in place, as well as beyond the pandemic era. So we know that, you know, immigrant status and educational attainment, social class, income, they all influence physical activity levels among any population that we look at. So it is important to consider those factors when planning physical activity promotion at the population level. In the next study, we examined the changes in 24-hour movement behaviors among South Korean adolescents. So we used the data from Korean Youth Risk Behavior web-based survey in 2019 and 2020. So each survey data included approximately 45,000 people, excluding missing cases. And exposures included gender, family, economic status, financial impact due to COVID-19 from 2020 data, and academic performance. Outcomes included meeting 24-hour movement guidelines, and I will introduce what these guidelines are in the next slide. And for analysis, we used the decision tree analysis, interaction moderation, and stratified regressions. So before we get into the findings, I would like to introduce 24-hour movement behaviors. So it is published in 2017 by the Canadian researchers. So right now, many countries have 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth, and this was the first one that was published globally. So if we look at specific recommendations within the 24-hour movement guidelines for moderate to vigorous physical activity, more than 60 minutes daily is recommended. For recreational screen time on a daily basis, no more than 2 hours per day is recommended. And as for sleep, uninterrupted 9 to 11 hours of daily sleep for those who are less than 13 years old, and 8 to 10 hours of sleep is recommended daily for those who are 14 and 17 years. So given these recommendations, we looked at the adherence to 24-hour movement guidelines in 2019 and 2020 among Korean adolescents. And what we found is that for moderate to vigorous physical activity and sleep, there were no substantial changes. So when we look at moderate to vigorous physical activity, in green line here, pre-COVID-19, it was only 6.1% who met the recommendation. During COVID-19, it was 5.8%. So there was a slight decrease in the proportion of meeting the moderate to vigorous physical activity recommendation, but not substantial. When we look at sleep in purple, it was similar. So pre-COVID-19, 19.6% of adolescents met the sleep recommendations, whereas during COVID-19, 19.4% met the sleep recommendations. So it was pretty similar pre-COVID and during COVID. And the substantial difference was found for screen time recommendations. So those who met screen time recommendation was 32.2% during pre-COVID-19, whereas during COVID-19 was 20.2%. So less than 12% of adolescents met the screen time recommendation during COVID-19 compared to pre-COVID-19. So in other words, we can interpret these results as seeing no changes in physical activity and sleep, but seeing a decrease for screen time. So more adolescents are engaging in screen time behaviors. So more adolescents are watching TV, playing more video games, and just spending more time in front of a screen. When we look at gender disparities using the 2020 data, those who are meeting the moderate to vigorous physical activity recommendation was 8.7% among boys and 3% among girls. Almost triple more boys were engaging in physical activity compared to girls. When we look at screen time recommendation, it was pretty similar between genders. So among girls, it was 19.9% who met the screen time recommendation, whereas in boys, it was 19.6%. So only 0.3% difference that we observed for screen time recommendation. For sleep recommendation, again, boys were more likely to meet the sleep recommendation, so 19.2%, met the sleep recommendation among boys, whereas in girls, the corresponding percentage was 12.6%. But as you can see, overall, meeting different individual recommendation is really low among Korean adolescents. So when we look at the correlates, so population groups that are more likely to meet moderate to vigorous physical activity recommendation, as you can see in this graph, it was boys. So more boys were more likely to meet physical activity recommendations than girls. And among boys, high economic status and low academic performance were more conducive to meeting physical activity recommendation among boys. Among girls, low academic performance and high economic status were also more conducive to meeting physical activity recommendation among girls as well. As for screen time, so we found that there were essentially no gender differences in terms of meeting the screen time recommendation. And the most important predictor based on the decision tree analysis was academic performance. So those who performed better academically were more likely to meet screen time recommendation compared to those who perform poorly in academics. And among those who perform well, high economic status and being a boy were more conducive to meeting screen time recommendation. As for meeting the sleep recommendation, similar to physical activity, more boys were meeting the sleep recommendation compared to girls. Among boys, high academic status was an important predictor for meeting the sleep recommendation. Among girls, low and middle academic performance was more associated with meeting the sleep recommendation compared to high academic performance. So some of the important conclusions from the South Korean study: no significant changes were observed for meeting physical activity and sleep recommendations, but meeting screen time recommendation worsened during pandemic. In terms of gender disparities, girls were less likely to meet physical activity and sleep recommendations, similar to previous studies during pre-pandemic. So there were no changes in terms of gender disparities in meeting physical activity and sleep recommendations. But for meeting the screen time recommendation, gender was not an important predictor. So boys and girls, they engaged in similar amount of screen time, regardless of their genders, but the important predictor for meeting the screen time recommendation was high academic performance. So those who perform better academically were more likely to meeting screen time recommendations compared to those who perform poorly. Lastly, high economic status and low academic performance were supportive of meeting physical activity and sleep recommendations. And these are, pretty similar to research evidence outside of South Korea. So lastly, some of the strategies for post-pandemic era to promote physical activity and get back to normal. First of all, it is important to increase equitable access to public spaces where people can engage in different types of physical activities. So it includes outdoor spaces as well as indoor spaces. So building healthy communities is really important. The next one, healthy schools. So providing equal opportunities for physical activity would be really important for the post-pandemic era, and school-based physical education could be a really good viable option to increase physical activity among both boys and girls. Lastly, healthy populations, so focusing on population groups that experience more barriers to physical activity would be important. So among Canadians, those who are immigrated, those who experience more financial impact due to COVID-19 will be an important population subgroup that we need to focus. Among South Korean adolescents, girls with low family economic status and high academic performance require more attention than other population groups. So this is my presentation for today. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, you can email me or you can tweet me. And I also provide my webpage address here. Thank you.
예, 퀸즈 유니버시티의 이은영 교수님의 흥미로운 발표 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 다음 발제로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 다음 발제는 캠브리지 유니버시티의 소렌 브라즈 교수님과 테사 스트레인 박사님께서 준비하신 영상으로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 발제의 제목은 Impact of a National COVID-19 Lockdown on Physical Activity in England입니다.
Hello, I'm Soren Brage from the University of Cambridge, and in a moment I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tessa Strain, who's going to present our work on the impact of the lockdown on physical activity in England. However, beforehand, just a little bit of context. So the Black Death came to England in the mid-14th century, and over the next 300 years we had about 40 outbreaks of the plague, followed by other outbreaks of other infectious diseases, such as smallpox and cholera. And those were really the main causes of death in historic times. From the mid-19th century or so, we see a remarkable increase in life expectancy, however, from a level of about 40 years to about 80 years in more modern times. There's some notable dents in that, most prominently the one caused by the Spanish flu in 1918. As you may know, it was the second wave of the Spanish flu that claimed the most lives, and sadly that was also the case for COVID deaths in the United Kingdom. The map shows the distribution of COVID deaths in England and Wales, and if we compare that to the map of child mortality 170 years earlier in England and Wales, we see some striking similarities here, and this really points to there might be some underlying causes that are similar in increasing disease susceptibility between these otherwise very different outcomes. In terms of what we might do about the problem, well, in the absence of effective treatment or vaccination, there really are only very few things we could do, and as was the case in historic times, these include quarantine and the restriction of movement of people and goods, and then the use of protective equipment such as face coverings. The top drawing there showing a man trying to protect himself against cholera, for example, and the bottom drawing there shows John Snow with his map having identified the Broad Street pump as the source of contaminated water that caused cholera, and the police officers there breaking off the handle so that those people living there would have to get their water from somewhere else. Now, a lockdown is one of our most extreme public health measures in order to slow down the transmission of disease, and whilst it might be effective in doing that, it may also potentially have some negative consequences. So turning our attention to physical activity, the world map here shows the decline in physical activity measures as measured by Fitbit data, and the lines there on the right shows several countries and the timelines of them in terms of smartphone detected steps. And we certainly see some declines across the board of these objective data. And whilst these data sources are certainly very valuable, they're unlikely to be nationally representative, and they can't tell us anything about subgroups who indeed may be less likely to own such devices and indeed may be more vulnerable to the impact of extreme public health measures. So with that, I'm going to turn the baton over to Tessa.
Hi, my name is Tessa Strain. I work at the MLC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge, and I'm really grateful for the invite today to talk about our work on the impact of a national lockdown on physical activity levels in England. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the restrictions that we've been under for the last year and a half. As you can see, we've had periods of rather strict lockdowns with some restrictions in between. The first lockdown was introduced at the end of March 2020, the restrictions in between and the subsequent lockdowns have varied quite a lot in content in terms of what was restricted and where they applied. But this first lockdown was universal in England, and our work focuses on this period. The instructions at the time were that the whole population needed to stay at home, and there were just a few exceptions for this: to shop for necessities, for medical needs, to travel to work where it was absolutely necessary, and for one bout of daily exercise. But all sports facilities and non-essential shops were closed. The data we're using comes from the Active Life Survey, which has been running continuously for about the last 5 years. It is huge in terms of sample size. We have data from over 170,000 adults, that's over 16 years of age, annually. And it's random probability sampled, so it's then weighted on demographic characteristics so that it is representative of the population in England. It's pushed to web as a design, which means participants are sent a letter that directs them online to the questionnaire, but they can complete a paper option if they prefer. This has been really critical because other surveys in the UK rely on face-to-face interviews, and that has had to obviously stop during the lockdowns. So this is the only national survey able to continue uninterrupted through this period. The physical activity data is really detailed. It's recall in the past 4 weeks, and they collect data on frequency, duration, and intensity of really specific activity types. It's non-occupational, so it involves travel activity and leisure activity. There's also some data on just participation, so not the detailed frequency, intensity, duration, but just participation in the specific activities for a longer time frame than just the last month. But I'll go into that in more detail as we use this data in our work. There are also questions on demographic and geographic characteristics, which we use as both stratifiers in this analysis and adjust for as potential confounders. Jumping straight into the results, I'll just show you this overview of mean activity levels over the sort of 5 years of data collection. And what we have here is obviously the sort of 12 months of the year, but different lines for the different years from 2015 to 2020, with the lightest colour being the 2015 furthest away from now, and the darkest being 2020. And immediately you can see that this month, the fourth period of the year, respondents that took the survey in April to May, so their recall period was that March to April lockdown, that the activity levels, mean minutes per week, are considerably lower than we'd expect for that time of year. What this next slide shows is the composition of that mean minutes of activity for the month of interest, that lockdown month, across the 5 years of data we have, so 2016 through to 2020. And the first thing I think to note is that the bar for 2020 is lower, as we saw in the previous chart. But starting at the top, we can see that dark blue colour is gardening, and we can see how that actually has really increased in 2020. And so if we were not including gardening, then the drop would be even greater between the previous 4 years and 2020. But moving down into other categories, it's obvious that team sports, or those relying on facilities, have all reduced a lot. So that's the light blue of team sports. The swimming and diving is the dark purple that's gone. The light purple is other sport and leisure activities. And the red of fitness and the sort of pinky golf have all gone down in size compared with the previous 4 years. Walking at the bottom there may be covered by my picture. The light grey is walking for travel and the dark is walking for leisure. So you can see walking for leisure has actually increased, although there was an upward trend through the previous 4 years. But walking for travel has really significantly decreased. None of these are unexpected given the restrictions we were under, but it is interesting to quantify and to see the data on it. Having just presented a load of mean values, I'm now going to tell you why that's not the best way to summarize the data. Here in this slide, I'm showing you the frequency density distributions of non-occupational physical activity across the 5 years of data. And what's immediately obvious is that it's non-normally distributed. We have a huge spike of zeros, as is common in self-report data. And then the rest of the distribution is actually more like a gamma kind of distribution. But essentially, if you take a mean value, that's not going to fully capture what's going on in terms of changes between 2020 and the previous 4 years, which is our main research question. So what we decided to do based on looking at these histograms is to split our regressions into 2. Firstly, we were going to look at logistic regression, a binary indicator of people who report no activity and those that report some activity. Next, we were going to drop all the people that only reported 0 and get rid of that spike. And so we could just look at those that were reporting any activity. And then we could use a gamma model to look at differences in the mean duration of activity there. And here are the results of those regressions. Actually, the first panel is just prevalence. It's showing the proportions or the percentage of each subgroup that is reporting any activity in 2020 and 2016 to 19, the average of those 4 years. The second panel is the logistic regression of that, so it's trying to quantify the difference between 2020 and the previous 4 years, trying to show which subgroups were more affected than others. And then the last panel is a comparison of the duration of activity. So going back to the first panel to just talk about that in more detail, we can see that the navy dots are reflecting 2020 and the orange are the previous 4 years. And we can see that the navy dots are always to the left. They're always lower than the previous 4 years. So regardless of subgroup, we can see that the proportion reporting any activity was lower in 2020. To see which groups were more affected in 2020 than others, so essentially trying to quantify that difference between the orange and the navy dots, how wide apart those dots are, that's what that middle panel is doing. And so the further away the odds ratio is from the null, which is the vertical black dotted line, the bigger the difference in 2020. That's potentially, if we interpret it this way, that lockdown has had a greater effect. And immediately I want to pull out the youngest age groups as being the age groups that actually seem to have been most affected by lockdown. Okay, if we look to the first panel, they have the highest levels to start with, but it seems that it's almost like the inequality between the age groups got normalized in 2020, because the younger age groups were brought down so much more. And if we look to the students who are often in this age category, we see pretty much the same result there. I don't want to ignore the final column of the mean durations, but they can be hard to interpret. In this case, we see a lower mean duration in 2020 compared with 2016 to 19. So we can pretty much say that it's not only that more people are not doing any activity, those that are in these age groups, those that are doing activity seem to have done less in 2020 compared with other years. So across the board, the distribution has shifted in these age groups. Picking up on another characteristic here, we've got ethnicity, and we can see that the non-white ethnicities seem to have been more affected by lockdown than others. And the unemployed are also a group that I want to pull out as seemingly having been more affected in 2020 than other subgroups. I'm now going to show you essentially the same results, but for walking only as opposed to or total activity. So on the left, we've got walking for leisure, and on the right, we've got walking for travel. I've missed out the third panel on each of the figures just because that's more complex to interpret, and just want to keep to the main story here. because they're kind of contrasting as to what's happened in walking for leisure and walking for travel in 2020. You can see that walking for leisure, that the navy dots are all higher than the orange dots, showing that people were more likely to be walking for leisure in 2020 than the previous 4 years in this lockdown period. And that's reflected by the odds ratios all being just in and around 1, slightly above 1. Whereas walking for travel has completely the opposite trend. There are large differences, huge differences, reflecting a really big drop in those participating in walking for travel in this first month of lockdown. And the odds ratios are sort of 0.3, so that's 70% lower odds of participating in this activity in 2020. I've not really got time to go into other activities, but as you can imagine from the previous, one of the early slides I showed you on gardening increasing, that has a similar pattern to walking for leisure. In fact, it's potentially more stark, and it's particularly evident in the oldest age groups, which may explain why they were less affected in the overall data than some of the younger age groups who potentially don't have access to gardens in the UK. They're not homeowners by this stage in life. I'm moving on now to some data I referred to right at the beginning about the trajectories of participation in the 3 months prior to interview. Respondents were asked these series of questions, which I'll go through and explain how we got to different categories for the respondents. So respondents were asked, have you participated in a specific activity, so for example football or walking for travel, in the 3 months prior to interview? And if they said no, that was a really obvious trajectory. It's just no participation at all. That's fairly straightforward. But if they said yes, they were then asked a subsequent question, which was, have they participated in the last 4 weeks? So if someone said yes to that question, then what we know about them is they definitely participated in the last 4 weeks. We don't actually really know what they did in the 2 to 3 months prior to interview, but we know they participated in the last 4 weeks. But if they said no to that second question, then what we know is they've done something in the 2 to 3 months beforehand, but they stopped in the last 4 weeks. So what this will enables us to look at is, in our case, people who were doing an activity in sort of January, February time, and then stopped in this month, which coincided with lockdown. And this figure now shows the proportions in those categories across all the different activity types. If we start with looking at any activity, and this is the top left 2 bars, take the 2016 to 19 bar as being a reflection on typical churn in activity levels on a typical year. So we expect about 6% to never do anything in the first 3 months of the year. That's basically this recall period. We expect about 92% to have done something in the last 4 weeks. And we expect about 2% to have stopped in the last 4 weeks, having done something previously in January, February time. And that could have stopped for any old reason, but that's a sort of typical churn in activity levels at an individual level. So when we see in 2020, we see this as being actually quite different. We see that proportion who have stopped activity going up to almost 6%. And we see the proportion doing no activity in the past 3 months going up a bit too. So this is generally complementing our previous analyses and showing, yes, it does seem like, even when we're looking at individual trajectories, that activity levels have gone down in the population. And when we look across the different sport types or sport and exercise activities, we do see the same trends. We see walking for travel, a lot of people having had to stop that in the last 4 weeks, and those activity types that rely on other people or facilities also being quite affected, particularly if you look at the light grey bar at the top. I will highlight walking for leisure because that is a slightly odd result to interpret. It seems like more people stopped that, 6.8% compared with the previous 4 years. 4.3%, but it does seem, when you look at the proportion that have no participation, that's gone down. So it's a complex story here. It implies there may be general trends in activity and walking for leisure that are going up, and so there's potentially more people are doing it, the more people are able to stop doing the activity as well. So it's not an easy one to interpret, but in general, these results are complementing what we saw before. To conclude, our results are strongly indicating that the pandemic-related lockdown reduced population levels in England in the spring of 2020. The impacts were not uniform across subgroups, and they also varied by activity type. And the two interacted. It's likely that some of the subgroups that were most affected relied heavily on some of the activity types that were most affected. So the younger age groups were probably more participated more in the team sports and that had to stop. So the pandemic may have created new, or it may have exacerbated old inequalities. And particularly of interest is access to green space and gardening. We saw that increase, but that actually was driven, I didn't show these data, but it was driven quite a lot by the middle to older age groups. And so that's something to consider for activity promotion policies in the future. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, the funding that we receive, and all of those that responded to the survey and have been involved in curating the data. Thank you very much for listening.
예, 솔 앤 브라저의 교수님과 테사 스트레인 박사님의 흥미로운 발표 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 오늘의 마지막 발제를 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘의 마지막 발제는 미국 NFL 인디애나폴리스 코츠의 Vice President of Data Strategy and Analytics로 재직 중이신 찰리 신 부사장님을 모시고 Pandemic and Acceleration of Innovation in Sports라는 주제로 마지막 발제를 진행해 보도록 하겠습니다.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie Sung-ho Shin. I currently serve as the Vice President of Data Strategy and Analytics for the Indianapolis Colts. First, I'd like to thank the Korean Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Sports Science for inviting me to speak at their annual International Sports Science Congress. Today, I'll be speaking about the impact of pandemic on the acceleration of innovation in sports. I think we'll all agree that pace of innovation and change is faster than ever as the world become more digital and connected. These conversions of these trends is fueling the rapid technology advancements and business disruptions. We're seeing incredible growth of volume of data. According to Forbes in 2020, the amount of data created, captured, copied, and consumed in the world increased from 1.2 trillion gigabytes to 59 trillion gigabytes. From 2010 to 2020, that's almost 5,000 growth. In addition, there are more opportunity to enhance customer experience by combining these data and technology. More companies are successfully leveraging data and technology to improve their core operations, as well as identify new opportunities in their business. And as we look to the future, the data itself will become increasingly commoditized, and the value creation will be driven by developing new innovative ways to integrate the data and technology into our business operations. When considering these trends, it's not surprising that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. We've seen companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon rise to the top by leveraging and innovating through the data and deliver greater value to their consumers. Well, sports industry has also recognized the power of data Many sports organizations, including the Indianapolis Colts, have started to undergo digital transformation to maximize the value of the most valuable resource, data. Digital transformation represents a massive opportunities across the sports ecosystem. Looking at team performance, athlete health, fan engagements, augmented broadcast experience, and other new services that can also be monetized. But despite these new opportunities, many sports organizations do face difficult challenges. According to Deloitte's research, sports organizations often run into a number of stumbling blocks in each of these transformation areas. People, there are lack of vision, sometimes stubborn culture, aging workforce, not fluent with new digital tools, unwillingness to change. These are all the things that are impacting from a people standpoint, as well as process. There's a lack of updated process to match the new digital vision, products, or platforms. Process-driven tradition versus data. And the last but not least is technology. There are a lot of complex legacy systems that still remain in play. Multiple digital ecosystems. Also, there are disconnected IT architects. All of this is preventing or limiting the sports organizations from transforming digitally. And then there was pandemic. As sports organizations continued to invest in digital transformation, everything came to a complete stop in March 2020, when all the professional sports leagues either suspended their season or delayed opening due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020 was an unprecedented time for many professional sports leagues and teams that resulted in game stoppage and reduction in workforce. According to the Landscape of Sports Tech report by Comcast NBC Universal, the report indicated that US professional sports loss from the pandemic could be as high as $14 billion. The sports market is predicted to slow to an annual growth rate of 3.3% in the next 3 to 5 years, which is down from 8% compared to the past 3 to 5 years that we've seen. 33% of sports advertisers plan to pull funds because of game cancellation or postponed games. 87% of sports leaders say the industry won't recover until 2022 or later. These challenges have forced many sports organizations to find new and innovative ways to drive their business. It first started with professional sports leagues finding ways to return to play. MLS and NBA were the first two leagues to announce plans to restart their league in 2021 in the same location in Orlando Disney, also known as the Bubble. For MLS, which resumed with month-long tournaments from July 8th, the Disney site provided 17 playing fields and 1,900 rooms to house 24 competing teams. Meanwhile, the NBA, which got back underway on July 30th, booked out 3 hotels to accommodate players from 22 franchises, in addition to their coaches, team staffs, medias, broadcasters, and league personnel. Both MLS and NBA entered their bubble armed with detailed health and safety documents. Those put together by their league spanned across hundreds of pages and emerged without recording any positive COVID-19 cases inside their sealed off campus. What really stood out from the return to play was the role the data and technology played. It included massive remote production, direct-to-consumer content development, and a niche broadcasting. In addition, there were noteworthy technologies that included OTT on-demand streaming, augmented reality, AK 5G, immersive video, computer visions, VR 360, and optical player tracking. All of these enhancements really helped amplify the fan experience as the game returned to play without having fans at the stadium or the arena. Speaking of fan experience, recently issued Kager Fan Demand Index, which is created by Kraft Analytic Group, still show many markets indexing below the pre-pandemic behaviors, despite higher percentages of the vaccination indicates fans' reluctance to coming back to live sporting events. This highlights the importance of finding new innovative ways to keep fans engaged and loyal until they came back. Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment in Canada, who owns the Raptors in NBA, as well as the Toronto FC in MLS, quickly realized that personalizing fan experience was the way of the future. In order to bring the excitement of live venue to fans at home, MLSE created a digital arena. Digital arena provides the ability for live game presentation to engage fans, allowing them to interact with digital experiences related to the game in real time. The digital arena led to enhanced game viewing experience. For example, fans were able to watch all angles of the games from the comfort of their home using multicam and 360 video technology. In addition, it created a greater fan interaction. Fans can interact with each other and with the game in real time, making predictions, answering trivias, and competing for prizes. Last, all of this also created new commercial opportunities. The teams were able to create new inventories and deliver new value propositions to their partners and sponsors. Fortunately, with the increase in vaccination and decrease in the case of COVID-19, some of the sports leagues have started to welcome back fans to live sporting events, and COVID-19 had left significant impact on their behaviors. According to McKinsey's Digital Insight, technology advanced the equivalent of 5 years during the past year alone. So the COVID-19 made tech adoption a health necessity across all age groups. If we look at some of the adoption of NFL's mobile ticket growth that we've seen during the past year is significant. Looking at Ticketmaster's report, the adoption of using mobile ticketing in NFL grew from 52% back in 18-19 season to all the way to 97% in 2021. Even at the Indianapolis Colts, as we head into our 21-22 season, it will be 100% mobile ticketing that we'll be implementing in our stadiums. Mobile ticketing is one of the key areas that sports is seeing an accelerated adoption due to the pandemic. The Sports Business Journal, the leading trade publication for sports industry, surveyed North America's top pro sports organizations. Of the 96 leagues, teams, and events that responded, 67 have shifted their ticketing to fully mobile, while only other 19 teams and events were between 90 and 99% mobile, and only a handful were at the level prior to 2019. In addition, Sports Entertainment Consumer Trend Report by Oracle indicates that fans are interested in self-service option to take control of their experience and create an everlasting impact beyond just the event itself. For example, 57% of the respondents would like to be able to schedule food or drink orders before arrival. 60% of the family said a fast pass option would be a great for them. 30% of the Gen Z would prefer to pay contactless via kiosk, and 44% would love to pay more to actually jump the queues. I'm sure there are many other areas in sports that will continue to see more innovations, and we recognize how pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation process. The sports industry should embrace the opportunity and make best out of the most difficult situation. Some closing thoughts. Whether you're in sports industry or not, I think we'll all agree that 2020 will be a year that we will never forget. We were able to overcome many of these difficulties and challenges faced during the pandemic by collectively coming together as an industry. Data and technology played a huge role, and they will continue to play an important role on and off the field. Many of the accelerated innovations that we've discussed today will ultimately become the bedrocks and shape the future of the sports landscape. As sports return to normal, we are confident the industry will prevail and rise to the occasion. I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. And please feel free to reach out through Twitter. My handle is CRN in Sports, or you could also connect me through LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
신 부사장님의 유익한 발제 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 이로써 오늘 예정돼 있었던 총 6개의 발제가 모두 마무리되었습니다. 오늘의 그 학술대회 1일차를 마무리하기에 앞서 김도균 회장님을 단상에 모셔서 폐회사를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
오늘 장시간 동안 제32회 서울국제학술대회에 시청을 해주신 모든 학자 여러분과 또 대학원 원생 여러분, 학생 여러분께 감사드립니다. 오늘 첫날은 저희가 국제학술대회로 진행이 됐고 내일 오후 2시부터 유튜브를 통해서 101인 101강이 전부 송출이 될 예정입니다. 저희 학회에서는 체육학 관련해서 여러 분야의 전문가들을 모시고 15분 영상으로 저희가 제작을 했습니다. 내일도 관심을 좀 가져주시고 함께 참여해 주신다면 또 스포츠 세상에서 벌어지는 많은 산업과 일들에 대해서 함께 공감하고 배울 수 있는 귀한 기회가 될 것입니다. 오늘 마지막까지 참여해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 감사 인사드립니다. 고맙습니다.
예, 폐회사 진심으로 감사드립니다. 자, 이로써 제32회 88서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 1일차 코로나가 멈춘 일상 스포츠로 극복하다라는 주제로 1일차 계획되었던 1일차 행사가 모두 마무리되었습니다. 마무리에 앞서 본 국제학술대회가 성공적으로 진행될 수 있도록 물심양면으로 후원해 주신 문화체육관광부, 국민체육진흥공단, 스포츠토토, 데상트 코리아 재단, 그리고 포카리스 회트의 한국체육학회 관계자분들을 대신하여 진심으로 감사를 드립니다. 그리고 마지막으로 김도균 회장님께서 말씀하신 것과 같이 내일은 골라보는 체육명사 특강 100일 주년 기념 101인 101강으로 진행이 됩니다. 바라기는 많은 분들께서 이런 특별한 행사를 통해 지식의 폭을 넓히시고 다양한 인사이트들을 경험하시는 좋은 기회가 되었으면 합니다. 그럼 오랜 시간 뜨거운 관심으로 성원해 주시고 참석해 주신 제32회 88 서울올림픽 기념 국제학술대회 1일차 행사를 이로써 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 오늘 행사 진행을 담당했던 연세대학교 스포츠응용산업학과 이준성 교수였습니다. 감사합니다.